Last time on Millennia Pendulum. I mean, Princess Weeks. And that racial ambiguity, that racial difference, is why he's treated so poorly by the people around him and why things are denied to him. Despite this explicit racial otherness, people will still act weird if Heathcliff is not depicted as a white man. So, the ball is in your court, Emerald, because she's making an adaptation of Wuthering Heights. So it's time. Well, that was a mistaken bit of faith. I can't say I'm surprised, but I'm still disappointed. And when I went to TikTok and X, and I am no longer there, you can find me on these platforms instead, to discuss my disappointment, there was a lot of lamenting, but as expected, a whole lot of actually, about Heathcliff's ethnicity, what he is, and sadly, but again, not shockingly, quite a bit of anti-blackness coming from complete rejection of the idea that Heathcliff could be partially black. As a result, I read all of Withering Heights. I found a bunch of academic articles and channeled all of my rage and frustration around that anti-blackness into this. So here we are talking about Heathcliff, because nothing aggravates me more than people acting as though I can't read. I can fucking read. Emily Bronte was part of the now legendary Bronte literary and artistic family, and one of 3 Bronte sisters who would become novelists. There was Charlotte, author of Jane Eyre and Villette, Anne, author of Agnes Grey and the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and Emily, the middle sister, who published Wuthering Heights in 1847 and died 1 year later at just 30. Wuthering Heights is a Gothic novel about the passionate and destructive love between Charlotte Earnshaw and Heathcliff, the adoptive son of Mr. Earnshaw of mysterious heritage. The narrative encompasses 2 generations, starting from when Heathcliff is brought to the Earnshaw home and raised among the family. Catherine and Heathcliff form a deep bond, but Catherine chooses to marry Edgar Linton, a wealthy neighbor, despite her attraction and love for Heathcliff, because she wants a high-value man, and Heathcliff don't have that money or the breeding that is necessary for a woman like her.
I shall be rich. I'll be the greatest woman in the neighborhood.
Heathcliff then leaves Wuthering Heights and returns many years later, a much wealthier man seeking revenge, psychologically and financially. This cycle of revenge is perpetuated to now encompass the next generation of young children. Essentially, Heathcliff married the sister of Catherine's husband in order to really just stick the knife in there. It's very Count of Monte Cristo, but much shorter, and also very Targaryen, because at the end of the book, Catherine II marries her first cousin, and just no one is considering the implications of that, which is weird. I'm also reading Mexican Gothic right now, so I'm very much locked into that whole okay, so we're doing incest again. Another one. Wuthering Heights was published. It was considered controversial because of the subject matter and dark tone. Many reviews, even those who found it deplorable, also talked about how compelling the book was. In the whole story, not a single trait of character is elicited which can command our admiration. Not one of the fine feelings of our nature seem to have formed a part in the composition of its principal actors. In spite of the disgusting coarseness of much of the dialogue, the improbabilities of much of the plot, we are spellbound. I mean, that sounds like a Goodreads review today. Reading it myself, it was very easy, especially in the first half, to be totally drawn in by the compelling dynamic between our leads. It is told through other narrators, so we don't know everything, but the outside perspective is enough to stimulate the imagination and give us a really insight into these 2 people in love. As destructive and genuinely toxic the match between Catherine and Heathcliff is, the fact that their vices are so much at the forefront of their romance makes it interesting. Heathcliff and Catherine's dark dynamic has gone on to be misunderstood by youths everywhere and an inspiration for melodrama for generations. Heathcliff has become one of the most well-known Byronic figures in the Western canon, to the point where you wonder if people mostly ignore the second half of the book, or just really like all the corpse hugging and child abuse. The book has been adapted to the screen several times, the most notable adaptations being the 1939 adaptation with Merle Oberon and Laurence Olivier.
It all turned out just as you once suspected, Cathy. that I had been kidnapped by wicked sailors and brought to England, that I was of noble birth.
The 1970s version with Anna Calder Marshall and Timothy Dalton.
You know you lie to say that I've killed you. I could as soon forget you as my life.
The 2009 two-part series with Tom Hardy and Charlotte Riley.
Oh, poor Heathcliff. Oh, I shall think it a dream tomorrow. And I'll be able to believe that I've seen and touched and spoken to you once more.
And Andrea Arnold's 2011 film adaptation that cast a mixed-race black actor as Heathcliff, with James Howson in the role and Kaya Scodero as Catherine.
How could you not think of me all this time?
You thought of me too, it seems. I just heard you got married.
When this casting choice was made by Arnold, and she also allegedly did seek out Roma actors for the role as well, it triggered a massive conversation once again about what exactly Heathcliff's race and ethnicity could be. After all, as I mentioned very extensively, even though it doesn't feel that way because of some of the comments I've gotten in my video about tall, dark, and racially ambiguous, for many Western novelists in the 18th and 19th century, when they called a character dark, it did not necessarily indicate that they were not white, because they would use that same term to describe people who were French, Italian, Greek, etc. However, I'd argue that Heathcliff is a different kind of example because of how explicit and integral his otherness is to the book. I myself am not Roma, and I've already seen so many people tell me things on TikTok that I know are not true with a lot of confidence. So I'm going to keep things cited and linked to a Romani creator who I follow down below, and just places where you can find more in-depth insight. Oh, my cat is scratching herself. Look at her little boo. She's so cute. I love my cat. Sorry. Citations will be down below because I don't quote all of them in here, but they all came in part of framing what I am going to say.
Freedom in thought!
When it comes to Romani and Irish travelers, they are often used in 18th and 19th century literature as a convenient other that contemporaries would already have impressions of, mainly through stereotypes. English, French, Spanish, a lot of Western Europeans especially, had and still do have a built-in stereotypical image of Romani people. I remember going to Paris like almost a decade ago and having our tour guide tell us to beware of pickpocketing Romani children. He didn't use Romani, that word, but I remember even that moment thinking to myself, like, what is this, the Hunchback of Notre Dame Disney version? Like, I don't understand. Like, we're still talking about people like this. As Americans, we don't have the exact same cultural language or identity around the Romani. Yes, there was that show that was on TLC. That's very different from the experience in Europe, especially with the way that slur has been normalized in songs. On Broadway shows, as the name of formerly incarcerated persons turned influencer adjacent people. So we just have a very different relationship to that identity and that word through the way that we have consumed art here in the Americas, even though it still has a massive impact in the way that a lot of works were written. In Deborah Epstein Nord's Marks of Race, G Figures and Eccentric Femininity in 19th Century Women's Writing, she says, if English literature of the 19th century contains within it a constant, ubiquitous marker of otherness, of non-Englishness or foreignness, it is a figure of literary origins and anthropological interests. Could signify social marginality, nomadism, alienation, and lawlessness. So this is where I spoil everything and state that I do think Heathcliff is most likely Romani, and I think that is the best casting choice for him in general. It ties very neatly to the archetypes of the time, but we are also going to get into why it's still very ambiguous as we go further along in this video. But I start this to illustrate something that is key to Heathcliff and something that most marginalized ethnic groups can understand. Perception matters more than reality, because looking a certain way is enough, because racists and TERFs all love to assume that they can spot the difference, that obsession with keeping things separate of class, race, gender. Those illusionary barriers are more important than facts, which is why ultimately, while we are having this discussion, it doesn't actually matter what Heathcliff is. What matters is that because he is darker in some way, people perceive him a certain way, and that he is not white enough. Throughout Wuthering Heights, there are multiple references to Heathcliff's skin color and his assumed ethnicities and races. Here, are all the examples. If I missed any, feel free to add or put a page quote in there, but I took receipts because people are annoying. And so this is what I have to do to show that I did indeed read this entire book. But I just basically went through, and anytime there was a mention of like his race or like other plot details, I kind of just highlighted it so that I could have it to prove to you that I read the book. And I hate to be that video essayist who explains everything like this, but considering again the comments that I get, I feel like this is necessary because this kicks a lot of people's asses in general. The difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality. So race is a social construct that categorizes people based on their physical characteristics and in particular their skin color. And despite how important it is, race is not a biological reality, but is a social and cultural concept. I am Black. That is my race. Ethnicity refers to a shared cultural language, customs, traditions. It's about cultural identity rather than just your appearance. So people of the same race can have different ethnicities. I am Black, but my ethnicity is that I am of Black Afro-Caribbean ancestry and Scottish. You know, that's what I am. But because I'm also born in America, that is my nationality, a lot of my way that I talk, the way that I move, a lot of the ways that I do this, my hands, my attitude, the way that I speak is because I grew up in Brooklyn. And so like that is all a part of what creates the monstrosity before you. Discussions of Heathcliff's ethnicity and race are not new conversations where Wuthering Heights is concerned. As you can see, he is clearly referred to at certain points as being Romani and Roma, using the G word as a slur. He's also referred to as resembling a Lascar. Throughout the entire etymology of that word, it was used to describe sailors from the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, the Arabic world, British Somaliland, or other lands east of the Cape of Good Hope. Finally, saying that he looks like an American or Spanish castaway and the fact that he was found in Liverpool alludes to the possibility of enslaved African ancestry. Liverpool is really important because it would become the most heavily involved European port in the Atlantic slave trade. During the Civil War, it was the most pro-Confederate place in the world outside of the Confederacy itself due to the benefits that it got from the cotton trade. Now, if you no date, understand it and say, well, Wuthering Heights was published in 1847. The slave trade was ended by the time that Wuthering Heights was published. So like, why would it matter that Heathcliff is found in Liverpool? By the time that Wuthering Heights is published, the slave trade has ended. However, the book takes place in 1801 and that's the current timeline, and it goes back to the past at least 30-40 years, which means that in the context of the book, the slave trade is on and popping. So that means that for the book itself, the slave trade is very much on the table as a possibility and an illusion as to why Heathcliff would be found in Liverpool. And also why he would be racially ambiguous, but could also be coded as something other than a Black person, because they have more references to the Romani identity than they would for a mixed race Black person. Due to the very nature of colonialism and racism, mixed race Black people existing in port cities, non-white people existing in port cities in general, was a thing. And I think that it's so interesting that when people talk about the context of the period as a way of saying, well, like, she clearly meant dark this way, not dark this way, it really excludes the fact that at the time that this book is written, in fact, for about a giant chunk of the literary existence that we're talking about within the Western canon, Black people existed. Spoiler alert. One of the most frustrating aspects about having the conversation about Heathcliff's identity and me saying that he was not white, that he was, you know, Romani, Indian, or Black, and people being so angry about the idea of him being Black as a bridge too far, as if the idea that he had Black ancestry made no sense at all. It has no basis in the reality of Wuthering Heights itself. As I've shown you from the lines before, he's inconsistently described throughout the entire novel. The scope is open to darker skinned people, which includes a mixed race Black person. This doesn't mean that I'm against the idea of him being Romani or Indian, because I actually love some of the fan cast. One of them has the actor who played Armand from Interview with a Vampire. I love it. But I hate the assumption that is rooted in anti-Blackness, that Black people just want everyone to be Black. Like, no. You have a colonial mindset. and you think that the success and representation of one group, especially a group that has worked very damn hard to get the representation, means cannibalizing other kinds of representation, because we are seen somehow as having too much. And it is already deeply, deeply fucking annoying. To get personal, this idea that there's some kind of context missing that I don't understand. To just talk my shit for a second. I have a master's degree in English. I wrote my graduate thesis on colorism in fairy tales, okay? Don't tell me that I have no idea what I'm talking about. You assume that because you assume ignorance because of the way I look. You assume all these really silly things when most of the time, especially those Witcher comment videos, they'll live with me forever. I'm on your side about all the criticism that y'all have, but y'all just refuse to not be racist and sexist when you do it. And that's why we can't. You know what I'm saying? And even going back to just myself, my own background, while my concentration was theory, I also loved 18th and 19th century literature. Just studying it on that level for my master's program meant I had to learn a lot about the context of which these books were written. My favorite book, if I want to be bougie, people ask what my favorite book is, I'd be like, Clarissa by Samuel Richardson. Okay? Because if I say that, you know I've read the bitch, because that shit is very long. But just in studying at that master's level meant I had to learn a lot about European history in those periods to understand the cultural context through which those books were written. And as someone who believes, for the most part, in the new historicism and cultural materialism schools of criticism, one of the first things I do is look at the context of where the author comes from. And then, yes, as a Black person, I do think about where Blackness fits into these narratives, especially when it takes place during a time period where slavery was actively happening, because that means that we're interacting with them whether we like it or not. So when I made my video, Tall, Dark, and Racially Ambiguous, and I took the time to explain that certain white ethnic groups, because we just talk about race versus ethnicity, groups like the Irish, the Spanish, the Greeks, etc., were not included, the Welsh, were not included in the way that other white people viewed the superior ethnicities within the white races. I said this loudly and explicitly, and yet still got a bunch of comments of people trying to Euro-splain to me as if I was missing some alleged, information. And I find this, frankly, deeply obnoxious because, to be quite clear, I may not be a historian, but I cite my sources when it comes to topics like this. And it's deeply annoying to have people act as though, A, I didn't explain all of this at the top, and then B, to act as though these issues don't have a clear evolution from those white ethnicities to the way that it impacts things today. Just a few weeks ago on TikTok, there was a dialogue happening about people who read the book Fourth Wing and see a main character as Black, getting massive pushback about that because the character was dark-skinned, but he has wavy hair, therefore he could not be Black.
And a black-ass nigga with white. Let's go.
While a lot of you guys are very concerned with the context of your precious Western canon, you ignore, very ignorantly in my opinion, the fact that through the transatlantic slave trade, we are now part of your Western canon. Yes, we are. I just had to get that off my chest because I have to say those comments are very annoying. I make mistakes, don't get me wrong. I misspeak, I mispronounce, I definitely own my L's. There's a bunch of them, I get it. However, I do my best to research because I don't like to look stupid or sound stupid. But going back to Wuthering Heights, right, and the Brontes, by the time that Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights, we don't know if she knew any people of color, but she knew they existed. I mean, do you know who is a literal contemporary of Emily Bronte? Frederick Douglass. They were born the same year. In fact, his best-selling autobiography was published 2 years before the Brontes began publishing their books. If Emily Bronte simply read classic female writers from the generation before her, or even her contemporaries, she would be aware of Maria Edgeworth's Belinda, Claire de Dora's Oruka, and Thea Ben's Orinoco. These books, problematic as most of them are, included Black characters. The transatlantic slave trade created a new economy reality that was tied to the buying and selling of human lives. Within Emily Bronte's lifetime, the most important and profitable slave port in England was in Liverpool. And you think she just put it there as a coinky-dinky?
This is the little gentleman I met in Liverpool who has accepted my invitation to pay us a little visit.
I've mentioned those other books have Black characters, but we also know that Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, which was written and published in 1814, the Bertram family, which is the main family in the story, makes their money through slavery.
Do tell us more about the Negroes, dear.
Yes, the mulattoes are in general well-shaped, and the women especially well-featured. I have one so easy and graceful in her movements, and intelligent as well. But you know, strangely, two mulattoes can never have children. They're like mules in that respect.
Excuse me, Father, for contradicting you, but that is nonsense. You cannot say such things.
And a discussion of what the book says about Austen's politics around slavery has been heavily speculated as a result. I'm personally team she was against it, so at least my white fabe won't be embarrassing me in the streets. But even if you look at Jane Eyre, written by Charlotte Bronte, Mr. Rochester's wife, Bertha, is a Creole woman from Jamaica. Her mental illness, her hypersexuality, and how she is presented against Jane in the novel has always read to me as part of the Victorian and earlier mentality that the climate of the West Indies isn't good for young women, how it, changes them, how their approximation to blackness is corruptible. One of the speculations of Heathcliff's ancestry is that he is Mr. Earnshaw's own bastard, and the idea of a white man of the gentry having an illegitimate mixed-race child and raising them in the family, or at least adjacent to white power structure, is also something that you would hear about when it happened. It was, again, not super duper common, but we do know that there are two fairly prominent examples, Dido Elizabeth Bell and Chevalier de Saint George, both of whom have movies about them. And again, I'm not saying this is super common, but when it happened, it was especially notable to people with education. Belle's family was notable. Her uncle, the man who helped raise her, delivered the judgment on Somerset v. Stewart, a case that decreed the right of an enslaved person on English soil to not be forcibly removed from the country and sent to Jamaica for sale. It literally started a new wave of abolitionist talking points. You have the Dumas family, and then you have the Chevalier de Saint George, successful, well-known Black mixed-race people who would have been relevant to someone like the Brontes. And I think you need to understand that in the 19th century is when you really see the birth of the tragic mulatto stereotype really taking root in literature. And while it's more prominent in American literature, there are mulatto characters, and I'm using that antiquated term because it's kind of to allude to the antiquated way it's done. There were mixed race or tragic mulattoes or mulatto type characters in what we consider not classic literature. There's one of them in Vanity Fair. If you watch the movie, that's where that character that Henry VIII rejects, that is an actual mixed race Black person from in the book. While we're so distant from it now, there is an entire context to which there is a lot of actual anxiety amongst the elites about what it means for these mixed race children to exist. Economically, socially, morally, because a lot of them were conceived through rape. And I'm not saying the Brontes were aware or locked into all of them, but even if they just read books, they would be aware. Emily Bronte's contemporaries included people who would be aware of enslavement, abolition, and at the very least, because she was educated, she would have access to other female authors who talked about these issues. Jane Austen, in her unwritten novel Sanditon, wrote about a mixed-race character referred to as a mulatto. It is the limit of imagination, and honestly a limit on the people who you would call titans of English literature to act as though they all wrote with a limited mindset. I believe that Bronte left Heathcliff's identity open to interpretation because she was challenging her contemporary audiences. Non-white people in these stories are often there for romantic reasons. The dark other against the fair white feminine. Their race, their ethnicity isn't as important as what they represent. And I can also say, as someone who is chronically online, white people don't know how to decipher race. Like, y'all are very bad at it. Like, we have seen that time and time again. Like, the amount of comments about Meghan Markle, like, you guys get confused. It's very, very weird. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that because of how the 18th and 19th century writers saw dark and Black features, it is possible that Heathcliff is not a man of color and would be someone that we would consider an Irish traveler or, like, Spanish or French, that he's not even a Romani. Like, he's just a white man with tan skin. In a modern adaptation of that work, and I don't mean modern as in, like, in the present day, but I mean, like, the context of today. In a modern adaptation, That doesn't work, I feel. The outsider status of Heathcliff is only further elevated by making him explicitly a man of color. It only adds to what is already there. It's absurd to present reading Heathcliff as a man of color and wanting him to be cast that way as somehow pulling away from the core of the book. A modern day UK and American audience will not be reading or absorbing Wuthering Heights the way a contemporary to Bronte would. I'm not saying we need to throw everything out, obviously, but someone like Jacob Elordi does not match up with what a contemporary today image of the struggles of a darker skinned man, Heathcliff, in the context of the book, absolutely does, because he is dark. And I think that it's not just him just being typical dark. It is him being dark, the way he laments his coloring, the words that he uses. All of it is, in context, is not the same thing as like Jon Snow being dark in comparison to Robb. And I emphasize darker skin because I think that it's important to talk about how color plays into all of this, even amongst, white ethnicities. When the casting for Jon Stewart just came out, people were justifiably upset because the key factor that was intended when Jon Stewart was created and became the Green Lantern, even though 2 white men created him, was to be a counter of the dark-skinned, angry black man. That's why he was even based off Sidney Poitier, who in his own way represented the respectable dark-skinned black man in Hollywood. This is it. There's a reason why this happens. And even if you want to pick, a spicy white, as we would say, then maybe pick someone who's more visibly Greek. Pick someone who visually looks like an other. And that's not what Jacob Elordi looked like. Even watching the Tom Hardy one, which I think is enjoyable, the way that they try to make Tom Hardy look like Heathcliff, I'm just like, he and Andrew Lincoln are right there. I'm like, it's the same picture, bruv. The final thing I've heard people say is the argument of why would you want Heathcliff to be a non-white anyway? He's not a good person. And when you read the book, he is really fucked up. But I think what's important besides that is how Heathcliff is molded into being the stereotype of what people wanted him to be. When you get villains and antagonists who are built around stereotypes because they're non-white people, and then there's a chance to adapt them and make some significant changes and add depth, we should give the chance to correct them from people in those communities. It allows someone with the experience of being discriminated against based on their heritage into the story. And why is that a bad thing? How does that hurt Heathcliff? All this to say, Emerald, I'm disappointed in you. I had no expectations, but I'm still bummed because, Wuthering Heights is a classic. And I think that whenever you get an opportunity to really allow the nuances of something like that to be at the forefront, it's really engaging and interesting. And it would have just been cool to see an actual Romani actor, an Indian actor, a lighter skinned but still visibly black actor in that role with someone who has the budget and ability to really go all into it. Because I think we also want non-white villains. Heathcliff decided that he's going to get revenge on all the white people who disrespected him, on an ancestral way.
My plan was to see your face, get revenge on Hindley, and then kill myself.
I really just want people to check their anti-blackness and to stop trying to use the context of the 18th and 19th century writing style as a way of sort of trying to use that as kind of a boom, gotcha. They don't mean dark like you N-words. They mean dark like us Greeks. And I'm just Savannah, slow down. It can be multiple things. And I don't think it needs to be a competition. But when you bring up the context of the 18th and 19th centuries and then pretend as though slavery and enslavement and the existence of the new class of mulatto characters, of mestizos, and how all those things interact, you're also being ignorant. It's very interesting to have a lot of European people come and explain why we Americans, especially Black Americans, even though I'm not Black American, but I am perceived that way, that we don't know anything, but y'all come and don't know anything about us or our struggles or what we're dealing with, but y'all are so mad. You should work on that. Anyway, I listed some sources down below that talk about race and gender in the 19th century literature. They help me frame this piece and I think provide some insight into the landscape of what other academics are talking about when it comes to race. And again, I think it's really important that when we are talking about adapting the classics, that we are adapting them not just by adding diversity, willy-nilly, but by actually taking the time to understand what it can do to the story, how it can elevate the narrative, and to do it well. So maybe it's actually a blessing that Emerald isn't going to do it, because I haven't liked any of her movies or her season of Killing Eve anyway. So, I mean, good for Jacob Elordi and Margot Robbie, I guess. Challenging how people see certain topics is such an important part of media literacy. To not just argue certain points, but actively listen to one another. Anime, for example, is a topic that can so often get bogged down by niche infighting that takes away from the actual important character and context study that can be done. That's why on Nebula I started my exclusive series Anime Court, where I talk about the anime I love, but also character and story issues within certain series. When it comes to learning about how to go beyond mainstream, there's no better place than Nebula. But Nebula is not just about my content. Some other reasons to consider joining: the ad-free viewing experience for all content on Nebula, and early access to content from your favorite creators, including myself. Nebula even has exclusive prestige originals. Two of my favorites are Dracula's Ex-Girlfriend, a new short film about two former rivals reconnecting over drinks and a quick bite, directed by Valentina V, starring Morgana Ignis, Abigail Thorne, and Brandon Rogers. Now I have two friends who have played vampires now. How exciting. There is Trying to Make Sense of the X-Men Cinematic Universe Timeline, which I love beyond words, by Lindsay Ellis. I grew up with the 20th Century Fox universe. I remember seeing X-Men in theaters with my mom. That opening sequence was amazing, and I've been Team Magneto ever since. It is a fun, nostalgic romp that I think shows how something like the X-Men was impacted by the MCU superhero genre template, despite being a definite game changer when it came out on its own. Nebula is a place where creators can do what they do best without worrying about algorithms or monetization issues. It's a space where we can explore complex topics, share our passions, and connect with our audience in meaningful ways. You can sign up using my link, nebula.tv/princessweeks, to get 40% off an annual subscription. Your support helps independent creators like me continue to produce the content you love. Thank you.
Gentlemen, I'm addressing them, undressing them. Got elegance, means not quite yet to be eloquent. Get it then, that's good, you could be my guest, so let's take it to a fancy dinner. After we dine, I'm dancing with ya. Name's June and I got a rose, but I gotta go do what? I don't know, but you're not the one. Hey, shout outs to Adam, OG Vibe crew. I am not working and never living ever to get a chick. Is that much work? Whatever, bitch. Friend zone, yeah, go both ways. I'm a bright side looking, bright-eyed student. Sideline looking for discoveries of the guys and women couples, but I'm good looking enough. And fighting for love is overrated. There are other things I can do. Chilling with Adam, eating White Castle. Love ain't a game, more like a raffle. Gold tickets ain't gotten by skill, hard work or will. For real, you find them in chocolate. Ha ha. Bust out the Cheetos, we that, cause we ain't the heroes. We're the dudes drinking Mountain Dew, feeling pretty good about it all, and that city of pissed off. It's the small things that you eat when you're broken and your heart feels like it's beat. Crush the shit off, cause I'm talking about a feast. So what's it gonna be? You want a number 3 from Blanco Fortress. On a date, make ladies swoon. Laying at a park, gaze at the moon. Smooth, in a poetic spot. You know I get her to talk, to put her head to my cut. That is not me, I am sloppy. I fuck up my witty one-lines and drop things. Not to over-exaggerate, but who'll get over a girl I master break. Dance and then walk it off, it will pass on and off. I love this girl, God only knows that's okay, cause I like roads. I like walking and I hate pity, long as I got my friends with me. Sooner or later I gotta get lucky, what I don't get is why I am